During World War II, the city of Aachen became a landscape of destruction, fear, and despair. As the first major German city to be captured by the Allies in 1944, Aachen was the site of intense fighting, devastating bombings, and countless deaths. The narrow streets, crumbling buildings, and ruined cathedrals created a nightmare setting, where soldiers on both sides faced not only enemies of flesh and blood, but also something darker, something unexplainable. As the war raged on, and the city turned into a ghostly battlefield, disturbing stories began to surface among soldiers and survivors. Accounts of spectral soldiers wandering among the wounded, unseen presences watching those on the brink of death, and shadowy figures vanishing into the rubble became all too common. Many believed that the spirits of those who perished there, both in the First and Second World Wars, remained trapped, condemned to relive the horrors of the past. Whether the result of exhausted minds or a true supernatural phenomenon, the stories that emerged from Aachen during the war continue to haunt those who dare to remember. After all, some battles never truly end, and some souls never truly leave. My name is Thomas Baker, and if there's one thing I learned in Aachen, it's that war doesn't warn you before it swallows you whole. I was 22 when I was sent to Europe. Before that, my life was simple. I worked on my family's farm in Texas, helped my dad fix tractors, and spent my afternoons fishing. But war doesn't care who you were before, only about how much you can take. And that afternoon in October 1944, I learned exactly how much I could take. My platoon was already down to 4 men. Me, Sergeant James Holloway, a hardened veteran who seemed like he had seen it all. He was our leader, tough, straightforward, but always kept his cool. Then there was Private William Billy Carter, a skinny, fast-talking kid from Georgia who smoked like a chimney. And last, Henry Olson, our scout. A tall, quiet guy, but efficient as hell. We had already been through things no one should ever see, but nothing had prepared us for Aachen. The city was in ruins. Not a single building stood intact, only charred husks and rubble covering the streets. The stench of death was everywhere. Bodies of soldiers, both American and German, rotted beneath the wreckage, forgotten in the chaos. We were trying to regroup with the rest of our unit, but the streets were a maze of debris and shadows. Every corner felt like an ambush waiting to happen. The silence was suffocating, nothing but the rustling wind and the careful crunch of our boots on the rubble. Then we heard the first shot. A sharp, precise crack, a single gunshot. Olson dropped face first to the ground, not even a chance to scream. The impact kicked up dust, and I saw blood pooling beneath him, staining the rubble red. "Sniper!" Holloway yelled as we threw ourselves behind the remains of a collapsed building. Billy cursed under his breath, gripping his rifle so tight his hands trembled. Another shot. Holloway barely had time to lift his head. A fraction of a second was all it took for a bullet to slam into the side of his helmet. He collapsed beside Olson, eyes wide open, lifeless. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. Too fast, too hard. It was just Billy and me now. We had no idea where the sniper was. We stayed there, frozen, as silence swallowed us again. Time stretched unbearably long. Sweat trickled down the back of my neck, mixing with dirt and the stench of blood. Billy looked at me, eyes wide as if asking what the hell we were supposed to do. But I had no answer. I only knew that if we tried to run, we'd never make it. To the other side alive. Then, without warning, Billy moved. Fear made him choose the worst possible decision. He raised his rifle and fired blindly toward the buildings ahead. Wild shots, hoping to hit something, anything. But all he did was give away our position. Another shot. Billy jerked back, his body twisting like he'd been punched. Blood bloomed from his chest. He was still alive, but barely breathing. I tried to drag him back, but he gripped my arm, his eyes desperate. "Run," he whispered. Fear paralyzed me for a second. The world spun around me. 3 shots, 3 dead. Only I was left. I crawled behind a pile of debris, holding my breath, feeling the weight of everything crushing down on me. I couldn't move. I couldn't leave. If I did, I'd be dead. I was trapped, and the sniper was still out there, waiting. The next move. Billy died in less than a minute. Now I was alone. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Fear kept me glued to the ground. The sniper was still out there waiting. One wrong step and I'd end up like the others. My breathing was heavy. Each inhale a struggle to stay in control. I checked my ammo, only a few bullets left. Enough to fight, but not enough to survive for long. The silence was suffocating. No sound of troops, no distant explosions. Just the wind pushing dust through the ruins and the stench of death all around me. I had to figure out where the sniper was, but stepping out of cover meant instant death. He was good, fast and precise. Demons like that don't miss. The sun disappeared over the horizon, plunging the city into a dull darkness. The cold followed soon after, sharp and relentless. My uniform was covered in dust and dried blood, and I was trembling, both from the cold and from fear. I couldn't move. Every minute felt like an eternity. The sniper was still out there, waiting for any sign of life, and then I saw it. Amid the rubble, just a few feet from where Billy had fallen, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't a living soldier. It was something wrong. It was pale, as if all the color had been drained from its skin. Its uniform was torn, burned, and its eyes empty. It stared at me and slowly raised its hand, holding up 2 fingers. Before I could react, the sniper fired. The shot hit exactly where the apparition had been, as if he had seen it too, as if we had both seen the same thing. The second day began with cold and hunger. My body ached from staying still for so long, pressed against the rubble. My throat was dry, my mind foggy from exhaustion. But I knew that if I tried to move, I would die. The sniper was still out there. I couldn't see him, but I could feel his presence, the same way an animal senses a predator nearby. He had to be exhausted too. This wasn't just my game. By late afternoon, he came back, the shadow among the wreckage, the same lifeless face, the same hollow eyes. But this time he raised a single finger. My stomach twisted. What did that mean? A warning? A sign? My instincts screamed that I was running out of time. And for the second time, the sniper fired at him. He was seeing it too. But that didn't make sense. None of this made sense. My body was at its limit. 2 days without food, without water, without sleep. My muscles were stiff, my throat as dry as sand. But I couldn't move. I knew the sniper was still there. I could feel his presence on the other side of the ruins. Just as still as I was. Maybe he was just as exhausted as me, but that didn't mean anything. One wrong move, one moment of carelessness, and he would take me out like he did the others. Then I heard it. The planes. At first it was just a distant hum, but it quickly grew into a deafening roar, a mechanical thunder tearing through the sky. I looked up. Fighter jets sliced through the dark clouds like blades locked in a deadly battle. Explosions lit up the sky, tracer rounds streaking across the twilight. A German plane dove, chased by an Allied fighter. Gunfire tore into its fuselage, and then I saw the flames spread across its right wing. It was going down. I tried not to think about it. Tried to ignore the war raging above me because my real enemy was still on the ground. But then, he came back. The pale figure emerged from the wreckage, the same tattered uniform, the same lifeless skin, the hollow eyes. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't hold up any fingers. I didn't understand what it meant. I didn't even have time to figure it out, because at that exact moment, the German plane fell from the sky like a meteor. The impact came first, a thunderous crash that made the ground tremble. Then the explosion, a burst of orange and red light that lit up the ruins as if it were daytime. A shockwave threw me backward, and even from a distance I felt the heat scorching my face. I had to shield myself from the debris flying in all directions. The air filled with the stench of burning fuel and melting metal. Dust rose so high that, for a few moments, everything vanished into a suffocating haze. When the silence finally returned, I opened my eyes. The building where the sniper had been was gone. Nothing remained but flames and smoldering rubble. And then I understood. The ghost had warned me. He had counted the days. He had shown the numbers. He knew. And the sniper had seen him too. I lay there in the wreckage, feeling my heart pounding in, my chest. My entire body was trembling, but not from the cold, not from fear, but because deep down I knew this wasn't a coincidence. I don't know how long I lay there, sprawled in the wreckage, staring at the burning building where the sniper had been. My body was drained, my mind still struggling to process what had just happened. I was alive. The silence was broken by the sound of boots marching. When I finally looked up, I saw the helmets and rifles of the U.S. Army. Reinforcements. They were sweeping the area, shouting commands, searching for survivors. I tried to stand, but my legs were too weak. 2 soldiers pulled me up, asking if I was injured. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain this? How could I tell them that a ghost had warned me about my own survival? Then one of the soldiers called for the officer. They had found a body. Amid the rubble of the destroyed building lay the German sniper, or what was left of him. The plane's impact had crushed him, but among the wreckage, they managed to recover his backpack. One of the soldiers pulled out a small notebook covered in soot, a diary. They flipped through the pages and stopped at the last entry. My blood ran cold. It was a rough sketch, a scribbled drawing of the same ghostly soldier I had seen. The same hollow eyes, the same stance, and right below it, hastily scrawled. In German were the words, "I must be going mad. A ghost is in my sights." Even after the reinforcements secured the area and I was taken back to base, my mind was still there. In that place, in those ruins, in that moment. I tried to convince myself it was just a war-induced delusion. 2 days without food, without water, under extreme tension. Maybe my brain had created it just to keep me alive. But if it was just a delusion, how did the German sniper see it too? How did he sketch that thing in his journal? How did he write those words? A ghost is in my sights, and the numbers, 2 fingers, then 1, and then nothing. As if he was counting down to something inevitable, something he already knew was coming. I left Aachen a few days later, but in truth I never really left. The other soldiers talked about the battle like any other fight. A tough mission, unavoidable losses. But I knew what happened there was different. I felt it. Even now when I close my eyes, I see that pale face, those hollow eyes, and I wonder how many other soldiers saw him before me, or worse, how many will see him next. My name is Edward Mills. I was a corporal in the United States Army and served as a medic during the final months of the war. I was never a superstitious man. I grew up on a farm in Kansas, far from ghost stories and curses. But what happened in those final days still haunts me. It was the winter of 1944, and our field hospital had been set up inside the ruins of a cathedral in Aachen. Most of the roof had collapsed, leaving parts of the interior exposed to the cold, gray sky. The damp earth mixed with the metallic scent of blood and antiseptic. We could hear distant bombs, but inside, our greatest enemy was time and death. The other medics and I worked without rest. Supplies were scarce, and fever and infection claimed just as many lives as the bullets did. There were nights when I held a man's hand, only to feel the warmth leave his body minutes later. You get used to seeing death. But this was different. The whispers started after the first week. The German nurses spoke of a soldier who walked among the cots at night. The night soldier, they called him. They said he would touch the dying, and by morning they would be gone. I laughed the first time I heard it. What else were they supposed to say? Everyone was dying anyway. But then I started to notice. Some men, ones who had even seemed to be improving, were found dead by morning. No explanation, no sign of worsening symptoms, just dead. And the worst part? There was always someone who swore they had seen a shadow standing beside them the night before. I was never one to believe in ghost stories, but that night, I saw something that made me doubt my own sanity. It was past midnight. The hospital was cloaked in darkness, lit only by flickering oil lamps that swayed with the cold wind slipping. Through the cracks in the stone walls, the air was thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and infection. The low, resigned groans of the wounded filled the silence. I was checking on one of the American soldiers when I felt it. A sudden chill, not just any cold, but a dry, piercing frost that sent a shiver straight to my bones. And that's when I saw it. Standing between the rows of cots, a tall, motionless figure stood out. He wore a German uniform stained with dust and dried blood. His face was pale, like melted wax, and his eyes, God, those eyes, deep hollow, like black holes swallowing all the light around them. He stood beside a severely wounded German soldier. For a moment, I thought he was just another survivor, delirious from pain. But then I saw his hand, thin, pale as a corpse, slowly, lower and touch the soldier's forehead. The man's breathing faltered. His body, once writhing in agony, suddenly went still. I blinked, and the ghostly soldier was gone. By morning, the man was dead. No sign of decline, no explanation. Just empty, eyes and skin cold as marble. From that day on, fear took hold of the hospital. After that night, I started paying attention, and I realized it wasn't just a coincidence. Every man I saw touched by the ghost soldier was dead before dawn. It didn't matter if he was improving, if his fever had broken, or if his breathing had steadied. When the sun rose, he was gone. No signs of struggle, no sudden deterioration, just dead. The rumors spread fast. Nurses began whispering prayers in their native tongues. Some refused to work the night shift, claiming they were sick. Soldiers who had never kneeled in their lives started praying before bed, murmuring desperate pleas for protection. Fear hung in the air like a thick, inescapable stench. A few doctors and I tried to find a logical explanation. Was it some undetected infection? A medical mistake? We performed makeshift autopsies, but the victims' organs appeared normal. There was only one strange detail. Their bodies stayed cold far longer than they should have, as if the warmth had been drained from them at the exact moment of death. Then, one night, one of the nurses, a thin young man named Fisher, decided to stay in the infirmary alone. Said he'd prove it was all just hysteria. He came back an hour later, pale as a corpse. He didn't say a word, just sat on the floor, trembling. That night, another man died, and Fisher never looked toward the dark side of the infirmary again. There was one man in the hospital who didn't believe in any of it. Dr. Klaus Weber, one of the few German doctors who remained after our occupation, was a man of science, methodical to the point of obsession. To him, there were no spirits, only diseases, human error, and superstitions fed by desperation. So that night, he decided to prove it was all an illusion. He hid in the shadows of the infirmary, sitting silently near the cots. I knew this because he told me himself, just a few hours before. "If this ghost exists," he said, "I will look him in the eyes." At midnight, he got his chance. Later, Weber told me, or rather whispered, what he had seen. The soldier appeared just as before, emerging from the shadows among the wounded. The same tattered German uniform, stained with dirt and dried blood. The same pale face, the same deep, lifeless eyes. He moved toward an unconscious young soldier and raised his hand to touch him. That's when Weber broke the silence. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice low but firm. "Why do you take them?" The specter turned to him, and for the first time it spoke. "They are already dead. I only take them where they belong." Weber said that in that moment, he saw something terrible in those eyes. Not just emptiness, but a void of endless suffering. A darkness that seemed to pull him in. That very night, Weber changed, and the worst part? After that, the death stopped. But whatever he had seen, it never left him. The next morning, I found Dr. Weber sitting against one of the cathedral's stone walls. He was still wearing his coat, stained with dried blood, his hands trembling slightly over his knees. But what truly made me stop was his eyes. They were wide open, bloodshot, like he hadn't blinked all night. He didn't react when I approached, didn't respond when I called his name. He just sat there, motionless, breathing slowly, After a few minutes, Fisher tried to help him onto one of the cots, but Weber refused to be touched. He stayed there for hours, saying nothing. When he finally stood up, he didn't exchange a single word with anyone. He just went back to work, as if nothing had happened. But he never looked into the darkness of the cathedral again. And somehow, the ghost disappeared with him. That night, not a single man died without explanation. And the night after that, the same. The night soldier never appeared again. A few days later, the hospital was evacuated. The war was moving forward, and what remained of Aachen was in ruins. When we left, no one spoke about what had happened there. Not even me. But sometimes, when the wind blows strong and the silence weighs heavy in the air, I wonder, did the ghost truly leave? Or is he just waiting for another war, more dying soldiers, more souls to take? Because one thing I know for sure, he never stopped. He just went quiet. The years passed, the war ended, but some things never truly fade. Years later, I heard stories from other veterans who had served in Aachen. Nurses who survived that time said they still had nightmares about the hospital in the cathedral. Some refused to speak about it, as if mentioning what happened might bring it back, but the rumors persisted. They said soldiers who passed through the ruins decades later heard footsteps in the middle of the night even when they were alone. Some felt a sudden chill, as if winter itself had held its breath for a moment. And the unlucky ones, swore they saw a figure standing in the shadows, wearing an old German uniform, watching. Always watching. Maybe it's just a story. Maybe it's just something we tell ourselves to make sense of what happened in that hospital. But then I remember what an American tourist once told me. He knew nothing about the legend, but he said that while walking past the ruins of the cathedral on a cloudy afternoon, he felt a deep shiver, like something cold had brushed against his skin. He turned around, and for a brief moment before he blinked, he swore he saw someone standing in the darkness, staring straight at him. He left as fast as he could. And me, I just smiled, because deep down, I already knew he never left. My name is Sam Miller, former sergeant in the United States Army. I've been through a lot during the war, but there's one night I've never been able to forget. I don't usually talk about it, but lately, that damn memory keeps playing, in my head like a broken record. It was November 1944, and I was with my unit in Aachen, Germany. The city was nothing but rubble, a graveyard under an open sky. The stench of smoke, gunpowder, and rotting bodies mixed with the biting cold of winter. We had been there for weeks, pushing the Germans back and trying to keep ourselves together. That night, it was just me and 3 other soldiers. Dawson, a loudmouthed kid from New York. Reynolds, a superstitious southerner who always had a ghost story to tell. And Captain Lewis, a quiet man who had seen way too much of war. We sat around a small makeshift fire. We knew we shouldn't have lit it, too dangerous, but we were freezing and the smuggled whiskey helped take the edge off. Then Dawson broke the silence, said that on his way back from patrol, he saw a German soldier standing at a street corner watching him, blinked, and the guy was gone. Lewis glanced at him and muttered, "I saw that same bastard 3 nights ago." Reynolds went pale. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. We didn't say another word. That night, none of us slept well. And in the morning, we found fresh footprints around the fire, footprints none of us had made. The next morning, no one wanted to talk about the footprints around the fire, but you could see it in everyone's eyes. It was bothering us. The snow was untouched beyond our little circle, with no signs of anyone approaching or leaving. Still, we had a job to do. We were assigned another patrol through the ruins of Aachen, checking for possible enemy movement. The city was too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I led the way, followed by Lewis, Dawson, and Reynolds. We moved cautiously through the rubble, weapons ready. Then Lewis suddenly stopped. "There," he murmured, pointing down the street. Followed his gaze and my stomach dropped. Amid the wreckage near the ruins of the church, he was there. The same German soldier, standing, watching us. "Shit," Dawson whispered. Before anyone could react, the man slowly turned and stepped into a narrow alley. I didn't think twice. Let's go after him. We ran toward the alley, rifles raised. But when we turned the corner, there was no one there. Only silence and an unnatural cold far sharper than the rest of the city. Fresh footprints in the snow led to the center of the alley and stopped. No tracks leading away, no sign of him. Dawson started shaking. This doesn't make any sense. Keep moving, I ordered. Whatever this was, we couldn't show fear. We returned to the shelter in silence. No one wanted to admit what we were all thinking. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. Reynolds was the first to break the silence. He was shaken. I've heard stories like this before. He muttered, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. My grandmother used to say that dead soldiers sometimes get stuck where they fell, like they're still fighting. Dawson let out a nervous laugh. That's bullshit. It was just some guy, maybe a deserter. He saw us following him and slipped away before we could catch him. I tried to convince myself of that too. He could have found a way to escape. There are tunnels, passages. He probably knows did he better than we do? But Lewis didn't look convinced. He stared at the ground, deep in thought. I've seen that man before, he finally said, and I shot him. The air grew heavy. When, I asked. 3 nights ago, I was patrolling alone when I saw him standing at the end of an alley. He didn't move, didn't react, nothing. So I fired. I saw the bullet hit his chest. He went down. But when I went to check, there was no body. No one said a word. That night, we heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, like someone was circling us. When we peeked through a gap in the tarp covering our shelter, we saw only shadows, moving between the ruins, but there was no wind that night. The next day, we were sent to patrol an abandoned factory in the city's industrial sector. No one said it out loud, but we all felt the same thing. We didn't want to be there. The place was in ruins, filled with debris and twisted beams. Parts of the ceiling had collapsed, letting in weak, uneven rays of late afternoon light. But the worst part was the silence. No birds, no echoes of life. Just the crunch of our footsteps over the rubble. We moved through the main hall, weapons ready. That's when Dawson suddenly stopped. He's here, he whispered. Too quiet to be normal. My blood ran cold. I followed his gaze, and there he was. Between the wrecked machines, partially cloaked in shadow, the German soldier stood watching us, motionless, expressionless, the same uniform. The same dead stare. Son of a bitch, Reynolds growled, raising his rifle. Before I could stop him, he fired. The shot echoed through the hall. The bullet passed straight through the soldier's body. No blood, no impact, and then he was gone. He didn't run. He didn't take cover. He just vanished, like he had never been there at all. Dawson let out a low, strangled sound. No one spoke. We just ran. When we made it back to the shelter, none of us could explain what had just happened. But we knew one thing. Whatever that was, it wasn't human. We returned to the shelter in a state I can only describe as pure terror. No one spoke. Whatever we had seen in that factory wasn't normal. Dawson was shaking. Reynolds had gone pale, and I felt a weight in my chest I couldn't explain. But Lewis looked like he had figured something out. Without a word, he grabbed a shovel and walked out of the shelter. He headed straight for the area where we had first seen the soldier, near the ruins of the church, and he started digging. "Stop it, man," Dawson said, still out of breath. "What the hell are you doing?" Lewis didn't answer. He just kept digging faster and faster, like he already knew what he was looking for. After a few minutes, his shovel hit something solid. I knelt beside him, helping to clear away the snow and frozen dirt. And then we saw it. Bones. The tattered remains of a German uniform, and buried within it, a rusted identification tag. With trembling hands, I picked it up and wiped the metal clean against my sleeve. The name engraved on it made my blood run cold. It belonged to a soldier who, according to our unit's records, had died there weeks earlier when we took Aachen. I looked at the others, waiting for someone to say it was a coincidence, that it didn't mean anything. But no one said a word. Because we all knew what we saw in that factory wasn't a man. At that moment, all we wanted was to get the hell out of there. We buried the bones again, not knowing what else we could do. We didn't want answers. We wanted distance. But as we stood up to head back to the shelter, he was there, just a few meters away, standing among the ruins, watching us. I felt it instantly. There was no running. My body felt heavy, like something invisible was holding me in place. I saw the same fear on Dawson, Reynolds, and Lewis's faces, but this time, something was different. He didn't vanish. He took a step forward, then another. He wasn't charging at us. He was just walking toward us. My heart pounded. My hands were slick with sweat around my rifle, but I knew shooting wouldn't do a damn thing, so I did the only thing that came to mind. I took off my helmet and lowered my head. Respect. The soldier stopped. His hollow eyes studied us. He opened his mouth, and for a moment, I thought he was going to scream, but he didn't. He whispered something in German, something soft, low, like a sigh carrying centuries of exhaustion. And then, he started to fade. His body dissolved into the air like mist disappearing into the wind. We stood there, frozen, not knowing what to think. The next morning, the footprints around the fire were gone, and the German soldier was never seen again. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want more terrifying tales like this, don't forget to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Your support is essential for us to keep bringing you new content. See you next time, and be careful. Something might be watching you in the dark.